February 14th, 2018. A normal school day suddenly turned into something no one could forget. In just a few minutes, 17 people lost their lives and 17 others were injured inside a high school in Parkland, Florida.
The man charged with murder in the Parkland, Florida high school shooting was back in court today as funerals were held for some of the 17 victims. 4 of the 14 injured are still in the hospital tonight.
But the most disturbing part that stays with people is that this didn't come out of nowhere. The person responsible had a history. People had concerns. Warnings were given, and yet somehow nothing stopped what was coming. That's what makes this story different. It's not just about what happened that day, it's about everything leading up to it. Before we continue, make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel, and let's dive into how this all began. To understand how this happened, you have to go back way before that day. From a young age, Nicholas Cruz showed behavior that made people around him uncomfortable. There were repeated fights at home, aggressive outbursts, and police being called to the house again and again. In fact, calls to his home started as early as when he was just a child, and over the years, they kept coming. As he grew older, the behavior didn't settle down. It escalated. Neighbors described him as someone who was always getting into trouble. There were reports of him hurting small animals, carrying weapons like pellet guns, and showing a growing fascination with violence. One neighbor even recalled that police were showing up almost every other week. At school, things weren't any better. He racked up more than 24 disciplinary incidents over a few years. These ranged from fights to serious behavioral issues that made both students and teachers uneasy. This wasn't one bad moment. It was a long, as visible pattern that kept building over time. At some point, this stopped being just behavior and started making people uneasy. And when people start feeling that way, they don't stay silent. Over the years, authorities received a large number of calls connected to Nicholas Cruz. Records show at least 45 calls linked to him, his brother, or the family home between 2008 and 2017. These weren't random complaints. Some of them described threats, violence, and serious concerns about what he might do. One warning stood out. In early 2016, there was a report that he had talked about shooting up a school.
Going to be the next school shooter of 2018. Location is Stoneman, Douglas.
That information was passed along, but it didn't lead to any strong action. Online, the signs were even clearer. His social media accounts were filled with posts about weapons and disturbing thoughts. At one point, a YouTube comment under his name read, "I'm going to be a professional school shooter." That comment was reported, and agents even followed up briefly, but they couldn't identify him at the time. People around him were noticing. Some even said it would not be surprising if something serious happened. The warnings were not hidden. They were repeated, direct, and serious. By now, this wasn't hidden. It was being reported again and again. But reports alone don't stop anything. Action does. In school, there were clear signs that something wasn't right. He had been moved between schools multiple times in just a few years, and eventually he was expelled in 2017 for disciplinary reasons. Even then, he remained within the system through alternative placement instead of being fully removed. There were also serious mental health concerns. In 2016, reports mentioned depression, attention issues, and troubling behavior like self-harm and plans to buy a gun. Despite this, an assessment at the time concluded he was at low risk of harming himself or others. Law enforcement had their own pieces of the story. Calls, complaints, and reports were documented over the years, but many of them ended without further action. Information was passed from one place to another, but nothing seemed to trigger a strong response. Even when concerns overlapped between school, social services, and law enforcement, there was no clear coordination. Each system saw part of the picture, but no one stepped back to see all of it together. It wasn't a lack of warning, it was a lack of connection. And then came a moment where the signal couldn't have been clearer. A school attack. The caller didn't stay silent. They spoke up because they believed something serious was coming, but despite how detailed the tip was, it never reached the people who could act on it. It was not forwarded to the appropriate field office, and no investigation followed. Protocols that were meant to catch exactly this kind of situation were not followed. This was not a hidden sign or a missed clue buried in noise. It was a direct warning, delivered just weeks before everything happened. And then, a little over a month later, the scenario that had been feared and clearly described became reality. That time ran out on the afternoon of February 14th. At around 2:19 p.m., Nicholas Cruz was dropped off near the school. Just minutes later, at approximately 2:21 p.m., he entered Building 12, carrying a rifle and multiple magazines. What followed unfolded in a matter of minutes. The first shots were fired almost immediately after he entered. Within a very short time, multiple students were already hit in the hallway. The entire attack lasted about 6 minutes. And nearly all victims were shot within just under 4 minutes. Inside the building, confusion spread quickly. A fire alarm went off, which made some people think it was just another drill. Earlier that day, there had already been a fire drill, adding to the uncertainty. At the same time, no immediate code red lockdown was called, partly due to confusion over who had the authority to make that decision. Crews moved across floors, firing a total of 139 shots before leaving the weapon behind and blending in with fleeing students. In just a few minutes, everything changed. But even during those critical moments, decisions were being made outside the building that later raised serious questions. Because in moments like this, response matters just as much as prevention. An armed school resource officer was already on campus when the shooting began. He moved toward Building 12 but stayed outside instead of entering. Reports later showed that he remained in position for several minutes while the situation continued inside. Other deputies also arrived, but instead of immediately going inside, the focus shifted to setting up a perimeter. This decision created delays at a time when every second mattered. Some officers were even told to stay at least 500 feet away from the building. By the time Coral Springs police officers entered the building, the attacker had already left. In fact, officers went inside about 4 minutes after he had exited, partly because they believed he was still inside due to delayed information. The lack of immediate action raised serious questions. There was confusion, any unclear communication, and decisions that did not match the urgency of the situation. In the aftermath, multiple investigations were launched and several officers faced consequences, including resignations. The response itself became part of the story. While those decisions were unfolding, people inside were facing something far more immediate. Inside the building, everything came down to seconds and instinct. 17 people lost their lives that day, including 14 students and 3 staff members. Another 17 were injured, some of them critically. Inside the building, there were acts of courage that often go unnoticed. A teacher, Scott Beigel, was killed after unlocking his classroom to let students in so they could hide. Aaron Feiss, a coach and security guard, moved toward the danger when the situation began. Chris Hickson, the athletic director, also ran toward the sound instead of away from it. Students also made split-second decisions. Peter Wang was last seen holding doors open so others could escape. Another student, Anthony Borges, was shot 5 times while trying to block a classroom door to protect others. For those who survived, the impact did not end that day. Many faced long recoveries, both physical and mental. Some struggled with trauma and survivor's guilt in the months and years that followed. This wasn't just a moment, it stayed with people. And when it was over, the impact didn't stop at the scene. What followed was a long process of consequences, changes, and difficult questions. Nicholas Cruz was arrested about 1 hour and 20 minutes after the attack, just a few miles away. Years later, on October 20th, 2021, he pleaded guilty to all charges. In 2022, after a long and delayed trial, the jury could not agree on the death penalty, and he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The legal aftermath did not stop there. Families of victims reached major settlements, including a $25 million agreement with the school district. Other cases resulted in settlements ranging from tens of millions, showing the scale of accountability being pursued. There were also policy changes. Florida passed new laws, including raising the minimum age to buy rifles to 21 and increasing school security measures. At the same time, students who survived began speaking out. Movements were formed, protests were organized, and the conversation around safety and prevention grew louder. But even after everything that followed, something about this case still feels unresolved. What happened in Parkland didn't just end in those 6 minutes. The impact kept going, through survivors dealing with trauma, through families trying to rebuild, and through a community that had to carry those memories forward. Some survivors later struggled deeply with that experience, showing how long these moments can last. This story leaves behind more than facts. It leaves questions that don't have easy answers. What do you think? Could stronger action earlier have changed the outcome? And which warning sign stood out the most to you? Before you go, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments. Thanks for watching.